This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
In the UK or Australia, when a political leader hits tumultuous times, it's often not long until he or she is tossed by their caucus. But in Canada, it's usually up to voters to dispense with an unpopular leader, sending the party along with them. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post columnist Tristin Hopper joins me to discuss why Canadian parties seem to hold on to leaders whose political fortunes have turned, what that means for Justin Trudeau as his polling numbers sink, and whether parties who've ousted leaders manage to reinvent themselves in time to stave off defeat. Don't forget you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So Tristin, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has had a rough ride in the polls recently, and we can analyze some of that and what it means for the party. But
it's been almost a year now. You're stretching the definition of recently.
Fair point. But like, how low are his numbers, and why does it appear that Canadians have kind of soured on him as their leader?
It's been a while, so that's not me talking. I mean, there's been senior sort of Chrétien government officials, none of whose names come to mind, who have said this publicly. They've said if you're prime minister for 9 years, unless something extraordinary has happened, like a war has broken out, people are probably going to get tired of you. That's usually historically when we get tired. But over the last year, I mean, obviously he won an election barely in 2021, but over the last year, we've seen polls plummet at a rate I don't think has been matched in modern history. So this is something I've been sort of watching closely. And it's not only that Canadians have gone hard for the Conservatives, but demographics that have never voted Conservative in large numbers ever are starting to go for the Conservatives very explicitly as an anti-Trudeau vote. So young people now, and I don't think this has ever happened in the history of Confederation, the Conservatives have their strongest base of support right now in younger Canadians. So the under 44 are the most conservative. They're more conservative than the old people. So there's been times in history, I think in the early 1980s, where you had Conservatives capturing a plurality of the youth. But for the youth to be more in for the Conservatives than older people, maybe that happened in the 1870s, but I don't think it's ever happened. Well, we didn't really have old people in the 1870s, so it's a moot point.
So with all that in mind, with these plummeting poll numbers, there's been a lot of talk in some political circles that it's time for him to go for the good of the party. And there are surely others who would want to see the Conservatives take on a wounded Justin Trudeau in the next election. It would be an easier victory for Pierre Poilievre. And Trudeau is hardly the first prime minister to see polling numbers dip in the run up to the election. I know that you said that his numbers are quite low, but I mean, even Stephen Harper sagged in popularity in 2014, even though people thought he could get the job done in 2015. What is it about his polling numbers right now that has people talking about the need for a possible exit? Is it the fact that he's losing people who he's traditionally had, like you said, like with young people, or is it just kind of numbers across the board?
It's so precipitous. Yeah. It would be hard to see this as salvageable. So, I mean, we're at rates right now where they're sort of among several demographics. I mean, they're sort of tied with the NDP. So, I mean, under current conditions, they'll probably be the opposition, but I mean, it's on the table. If these trends continue for the next few months, you could see the Bloc or maybe even the NDP in opposition. So yeah, it's with each passing month, it just gets worse. There's been for 12 consecutive months, every time a new poll comes out, it's worse. So, most recently we saw the budget come out, and the budget was very explicitly tailored. Hey, we're losing the youth vote, so let's put together a fairness budget that talks about how much we love youth. And every single poll about that has said, oh, youth just hate him more since the budget came out. He lost 2 or 3 points. So, if you were a Liberal staffer thinking, don't worry, we'll bring out this fairness budget where we promise to build 2 million homes in 7 years somehow, then the youth will come back to us instead of the exact opposite. So, all of the usual tricks he's used to sort of resalvage poll numbers in the past, not only aren't working, they're making things worse.
Mm-hmm. And for his part, the prime minister has said that he's not stepping down. And I mean, to be fair, there's nothing to say that he has to resign. He won the election. He won the leadership. He's there. He, in theory, can serve out his time until the next election. And then if he wins, keep going. Why may he not be keen to leave his post? Is it a sense of duty, a sense that he wants to fight this out, that he feels
because he's a Canadian prime minister? So yeah, this is one. This is something that's very unique to us. So if you ever, if you ever feel you're not a unique as a Canadian and you don't have specific traditions, we're the world's largest exporter of pulses and lentils. And we have prime ministers who never, ever, ever leave, as compared to other countries with Westminster parliaments. So basically anywhere else on earth that operates under the British traditions, yeah, he would have been gone years ago. As soon as you went from a majority government to a minority government, I think it's fair to say in the UK or the Australia, he could have potentially been ousted in 2019 when, a bunch of blackface photos come out and he screws up an easy election. But in Canada, we do have a long tradition, and this has been going on for about 100 years. No, basically since the beginning, of prime ministers. Once they're in power, they stay way longer, way past their expiration date. So they stay past the point in which they can't win an election. They stay right up until the point when their party is, facing existential collapse. So I actually looked at, we've had 33 prime ministers. I think Trudeau is the 33rd. I hope I'm not wrong on that. But I looked through all of them. I said, what are the circumstances of each of them resigning? When you look at the UK, the Australia, New Zealand, you're usually kicked out. You're momentarily vulnerable, and your caucus rises up and gets rid of you. That's usually how, particularly, we've seen a lot of that happening in all of those countries in the last few years, UK being a great example. But I was looking up in Canada. We've only had one instance in which a prime minister screws up and his caucus says, oh, we're done with this guy. And they get rid of him within the week. That's happened once. And that was Mackenzie Bowell in 1896, 1898. So yeah, our usual pattern is you screw up again, you screw up, everybody hates you. The entire party is coming down on top of you. You're facing a massive landslide. And then maybe you'll step aside and then, allow a Kim Campbell or a John Turner to, take the ship down to the bottom of the ocean. So I looked into, there's a number of reasons why this might be the case, but yeah, this is a very unique Canadian phenomenon. You don't resign because people don't like you. You stay clinging to power until you are personally evicted by the Governor General.
We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Do you have a point of sale system you can trust, or is it a real POS? You need Shopify for retail. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify POS has everything you need to sell in person. Go to shopify.com/system, all lowercase, to take your retail business to the next level today. That's shopify.com/system.
As you say, there have been examples in recent history. Pierre Trudeau, one of them, Brian Mulroney, another, and Jean Chrétien. Although Jean Chrétien may have
all of those,
the same
I would
fate,
say. I mean, so there's been four people who resigned when they conceivably could have stayed on longer. There was no caucus revolt. Well, not really, and you mentioned that was Chrétien, Mulroney, and Trudeau. I would argue those are different than, said, the British or Australian examples, because Trudeau and Mulroney stayed they stayed until their party was looking at, existential collapse, particularly like Mulroney stayed until, there was going to be no progressive conservative party. And then he decides to resign. I would argue he stayed way longer than he should have. And same with Pierre Trudeau. And Jean Chrétien, a caucus revolt of sorts gets rid of him, but he says, I'm going to stay on another 18 months. People forget that. He said, I'm going to resign in 18 months. And even the foreign press said, this is a direct FU to his caucus revolt, and it's an act of sabotage. All of those speak of a prime minister with unbelievable power who cannot be shaken, and they're going to leave when they damn well please.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this has been exemplified in other Commonwealth cousins, as you say. Australia has seen this happen repeatedly. New Zealand, even recently, Jacinda Ardern, who was seen as a very popular global figure, saw her internal popularity fall, and she said, I'm gone. And most recently, Scotland's first minister said he was leaving. And you look at the UK Conservative Party, and it's been a revolving door situation. What is it about those countries that allows for that kind of thing to happen? Is there less party discipline or caucus discipline?
My sense is, So I spoke to several sort of insidery politico types, and I said, "Well, why does this happen?" And all of them basically said, caucus control. So the Prime Minister of Canada or any party leader has just unbelievable power over who gets to sit in caucus. So here's a main contrast with the UK system. So in the UK system, if you're an MP, you're ultimately answerable to essentially the riding association. There are sort of candidates parachuted in, or there's star candidates, but at the end of the day, every single election you have to be voted on and approved by the riding association. So you're ultimately loyal to that riding association. So you can get situations where, oh, who was that anti-Semite labor leader for the longest time? Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, during the Blair years, every time he stood up in the House of Commons, he was just, crapping on Tony Blair. He would have been gone in the Canadian context, but you can have something like that in the UK system because someone who is just, against, and he was a member of the Labour Party. So even a member of the Labour caucus, all he does is crap on, the Labour Prime Minister, Tony Blair. However, Tony Blair can't get rid of him because ultimately, if his riding association wants him, he gets to stay in. So there's sort of within caucuses, it's possible to have sort of a dissident element that's permanently there. Now, Canada, still, even though the Liberals promise they're going to get away from this, most candidates in ridings are sort of appointed. So, there's no vote at the local level. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau signs a form and says, okay, this guy, one of several people I went to university with, he's going to run in this safe Liberal seat. So he has unprecedented, way more control than anybody else in the Anglosphere over who gets to run as candidates. Thus, he's surrounded by people in his caucus who owe their political careers to him giving the green light. There are exceptions. There are open riding nominations, but still, I think the last election, there was an analysis, half of candidates for the Liberal Party were appointed. And then on top of that, once they get into caucus, he's got massive control to sort of get rid of any tall poppies. This was sort of exemplified by the SNC-Lavalin affair. You have his justice minister, or former justice minister by that point, publicly criticizing his position. So he kicks her out of the Liberal caucus, and she can never run for the Liberal Party again. You just don't have that much power in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. Thus, you can sort of have factions against the leader that form and publicly speak out against him and can oust him. So the last time that was able to happen was Paul Martin under Jean Chrétien, and that's partially because Jean Chrétien has sort of allowed Paul Martin was a very high profile figure, and it took years and years and years to get rid of Jean Chrétien. In the UK, you would have a constant faction of liberals who are openly critical of the prime minister, and he can't get rid of them, and thus they can form the core of any attempt to oust him.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the Canadian example and looking at this notion of caucus solidarity, on the flip side, you'd have long history of in the United Conservative movement, when the Conservative parties got back together as the Canadian Alliance and the Conservative Party of Canada, of Stephen Harper exerting this kind of control over caucus that allowed the party to stay together, not fractured, and a lot of people say that contributed to his ability to stay in power for as long as he did. Is it more a case of the leaders here having this kind of, as you say, this control, this cult of personality, kind of a feature rather than a bug in the Canadian system?
Yeah, well, there are examples of places in which, usually at the provincial level, in which parties are they're much more, it's much easier for them to get rid of leaders. And the Alberta Conservatives would be a great example. I think there was, what's the stat? Ralph Klein is the only one who lasted more than one term for all of the years that all the 44 years the Progressive Conservatives were in. And even just recently, Jason Kenney creates a party, crushes the NDP, and he gets turfed out anyway within 3 years. So I would argue in the places where that is true, where you have parties with a cultural tradition of getting rid of their leader as soon as they're tired of them, that's usually a recipe for staying in power for quite a long time because it keeps things fresh. and you don't have these like long stagnant periods, which we're kind of going through at the federal level, in which you're just completely out of ideas, you're completely out of touch, you don't trust anybody, all your media interviews are just sort of weird boilerplate, and you just keep going until you're forcibly ousted by an election. So yeah, I would argue, if you were looking at long-term success of your political party, you would want to foster a culture like the UK, where you just constantly can get rid of leaders at the first sign of vulnerability. So if you just want the Liberal Party to be in power of Canada for as long as humanly possible, you would want a system wherein, if a prime minister has a bunch of blackface photos come out during an election and screws up an easy chance at a majority, you throw his ass out and get someone else. If it was easy to do that, you could potentially be looking at a 15-year term for the Liberals rather than 9 years, and then they're blown out in a massive historical landslide. So yeah, there's reasons why you would like the ability to get rid of poor leaders, but we historically haven't done that.
Now, I mean, looking at the current situation, we're less than 18 months away from a planned election, and leadership contests in Canada aren't the quick events that we've seen in other countries like the UK. Is timing a factor in why you may not be seeing people within the Liberal caucus turning around and having it out for Justin Trudeau, considering where the polling numbers are at?
Well, what are you going to do if you're a dissident, and they exist? All they do now. So if you're a member of the Liberal Party who just absolutely hates the leadership of Justin Trudeau, and they do exist, all you can do now is give an anonymous interview to the Hill Times. Every few months, the Hill Times runs. We think we know who these MPs are, but they just say, anonymous member of the Liberal caucus. This, it's filled with swear words, and we're all screwed. And why doesn't he listen to us? So that's really all you can do, because, the moment you raise your head above the parapet and come out publicly and say, I think he's a crappy prime minister, we need to get rid of him. Not only you lose any cabinet appointments, you lose your parliamentary secretary, you also lose any perks. This is, one insider spoke to me and he says, you don't have any idea how much prime ministers are able to control their caucus with just perks. You're going to go on a junket to, this particular country, you're going to get this position on a committee. And that's another thing, and that's been there since the beginning, and that may exist in some capacity in the UK. So I've heard the argument actually that in Alberta, one of the reasons that Jason Kenney was turfed out is because he didn't have a lot of those strings to pull. Because all of those sort of perks that used to exist, you can stay a night in the Sky Palace. You can use one of the provincial planes. Since there had been so much corruption under the last years of the Progressive Conservatives, all of those perks were essentially gone. So there was only sticks and there was no carrots. His ability to sort of manipulate his caucus and keep them in line with presents and gifts and patronage wasn't there as much. I forget where I was going with the question, but I felt it necessary to point out how much our democracy relies on sort of skeezy patronage appointments.
Yeah, and looking ahead to the next election, like you don't get a sense that there's anything that's going to happen in terms of Trudeau's leadership in advance of the election. The Liberals are just going to ride it out, see how they fare. If they lose, they have a great amount of soul searching, and if they win, we have Trudeau emboldened for another stretch.
I think we as members of the media, we often we speculate on things based on what we would like to happen because it's more dramatic and more interesting for us. So I think whenever you hear, maybe he'll step aside and throw the reins to Melanie Joly so we can watch her flail around uselessly and then take the party down, I think that would be very interesting and fun for us. But I don't think it's likely to happen.
Yeah, we live to be surprised in the news business, but I guess, we'll see how things fare in the next 18 months. Tristin, as always, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest, Tristin Hopper. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.